Well, good morning. I come to you with a perspective not only as someone who's been an employee of a couple of Catholic institutions, a professor of law and religion and family law, but who has also acted as an attorney for various Catholic entities. I'm going to be talking about how the Catholic Church might understand the burden placed on their religious freedom by this mandate, in particular its interference with their governance of their internal affairs, and the lack of a rational, let alone a compelling government interest in making contraception marginally easier to access as a response to women's health need, possible evidence of animus against the Catholic position of contraception, and the value of preserving the Church's witness in law via a granted exemption here. So this is really difficult to do in a few minutes, but I'm going to try by presenting a timeline which weaves together information about the Church's constant teaching in this area, how religious institutions have played a crucial role in preserving it, and the correlations between federal government protected expansion of birth control and increased rates of every problem that the government claims that its program is trying to correct. So you know the pill hit the scene in 1960 when non-marital birth rates are about 5%. Much like the federal government today, its supporters proposed it would solve problems like non-marital births, unintended pregnancies, and abortions. In 1965, you know the Supreme Court holds in Griswold versus Connecticut the right of married persons to access contraception, extended to single persons in Eisenstadt in 72. In 1968, Pope Paul VI issues the encyclical letter Humanae Vitae, upholding the Church's constant teaching on contraception on the grounds that it protects the nature of sexual intercourse, this teaching, which is to both bond couples and to create children. The document predicts at that time that widespread practice of contraception will lead to more non-marital sex, the objectification of women, and the likely exercise of a frightening degree of power in the hands of governments who will attempt to impose their will on population to solve certain social problems. 2 years later, in 1970, the federal government gives us Title X, directed to birth control for the poor, although not all of it is means tested. Today, we have about 5 million people, about 30% of them over the poverty line, at 4,300 service centers, at an expenditure of $317 million federal dollars, getting birth control from the federal government. To expand on that a little more, you also have Medicaid, which pays 90% of birth control costs for the poor, and many states supplement the last 10. You have the Maternal and Child Health Block Grant, funding 610 school-linked or based clinics. You have community health centers serving 20 million Americans today. The New England Journal of Medicine predicts that'll rise to 40 million, providing birth control on a sliding scale basis. And then, of course, you have the hundreds of millions of dollars given by federal and state governments to Planned Parenthood subsidizing birth control. What's the data regarding the evils the government is anxious to prevent in connection with women's health? It looks like, and these are notoriously slippery figures, but it looks like unintended pregnancies went from about a third in the 60s to about 50% today. Abortions rose to 1.6 million before settling at a plateau of about 1.3 million. And according to a 2008 Department of Health and Human Services publication, non-marital childbearing has increased among every age and social class. Today, it is up to 41% of all births in the United States. Economists and psychologists looking at the law and correlating it with their own theories have said that in addition to the fact that birth control fails regularly, it seems to have inspired a well-known phenomenon called risk compensation, where people are increasingly willing to undertake risky behavior if they believe technology will save them. This has been also correlated in some of the most famous articles on the subject by Nobel Prize-winning economists with a change in the sex mating and marriage market in ways that immiserate women. So back to our timeline. So now, from 1973 now to 2009, we begin with a steady stream of federal conscience protection laws which protect both institutions and individuals from being forced to perform or cooperate with medical services they object to based upon religious or moral conscience in connection with a wide variety of federal programs, mandates, and funding. These protections are very, very similar, in some cases identical, with the protections proposed by the Fortenberry and Blunt bills to respond to this preventive health care mandate. From 1978 through 1982, you've got John Paul II's Theology of the Body, the first 130 Wednesday audiences of that Pope, which is perhaps the most detailed and compelling case for the preservation of the link between sexual intercourse, permanent commitment between a man and a woman, and procreation. I believe the fruits of this continuing confluence of legal protection for conscience and a flourishing intellectual support for the Church's teaching led at that point to a revival of intellectual and pastoral and personal attention to matters of human sexuality, including contraception in Catholic institutions. I don't have time to go through all of them, but one could say, in fact, that in many Catholic institutions, such as hospitals and universities, the refusal to ensure for contraception is the single clearest statement the Church makes in those institutions, because it doesn't carry it out in all cases in sort of conversation with employees or patients regarding its positions on contraception and human sexuality. You have documents from bishops, you have study groups, you have high schools taking up theology of the body curricula, you have women's groups, large women's groups, for instance, Endow, which are in dozens of dioceses, promoting the theology of body to a widespread audience of women. This has also borne fruit in Catholic universities and hospitals and other settings where conversations about the Church's teachings on human sexuality have flourished. We now come to the mandate today. It was instigated by recommendations, as was reported, from the Institute of Medicine, which was I don't know that there's any other word for it, a stacked panel of abortion advocates for the largest part, including the Guttmacher Institute, whose 1995 report on what the federal government should do about contraception uses language hauntingly identical to the language coming out of HHS today. This report was issued, and it relied in its recommendation for contraception, early abortifacients, and sterilization on documents published by Planned Parenthood, Alan Guttmacher Institute, and others suggesting that contraception was necessary for women's health, while completely ignoring all the evidence being put out for the last 30 years about the law and economics and the law and psychology of the relationship between government action and the immiseration of women via more out-of-wedlock pregnancies, births, abortions, sexually transmitted infections, and unwilling sexual encounters. It did this in a context where insurance covers covers birth control for the most part. Poor women report they are not denied access to it, and thousands of exemptions are granted to other groups. In fact, it's estimated that millions of Americans will be exempt from the entire health care law, including this preventive health care mandate. So in conclusion, regarding some of the issues that are raised by this factual timeline for our current legal questioning, one is the question about the burden on Catholic institutions. Theologians are writing about this all over the place right now, about the degree of cooperation that will be required in institutions if the mandate goes through. They are also talking about the fact that there is another question raised by the prospect of all Catholic institutions and individuals in the United States buckling under such a mandate and the scandal that that would give. And then, of course, there is the question of the necessity of fighting the mandate, because the situation today versus tomorrow, if the Catholic Church does not fight it, is a dramatic move from not having to violate our conscience to everybody having to violate it. So this undergirds the argument that we at least have to fight it. There is also the question that even if you set this aside, the government has interfered with churches' constitutional right not to have their internal affairs. The relationship between the employer and the employee intervened with and changed by the government. We are an institution, the Catholic Church, that sees outreach to non-co-religionists as mandatory. The language of Deus Caritas Est, Benedict's first encyclical, says, as a community, the Church must practice love. Love needs to be organized as ordered service to the community. Charity is not a welfare activity which could equally well be left to others, but is a part of the Church's nature and an indispensable exercise of her very being. You also have the question of what it would take for the Church to live like this in the world. They end up having to cooperate with those who are not of their own religion in large bodies, which end up being regulated by the government. There is also the question of the mandate deliberately drawing lines between institutions who feel they must serve the public in order to be who they are as a religion, and institutions who do not feel that way. There is also the final question of the possibility of animus in this. When the government adopts a position put forward in Alan Guttmacher's terms many years ago, knowing the hundreds of thousands of comments that have come its way and they rejected regarding the burden it would be on the church, knowing the absence of prior difficulties in the populace and with women's health in connection with the churches not providing this service for the hundreds of years that we have been serving those not of our faith in the United States. So finally, what would be the shape of the conscience protection that the church is calling for? All religious institutions and individuals, based on the prior experience that we have, not only as a leavening institution, raising questions about women's health and human sexuality that others are not raising, in light of the great burden it would constitute on the churches to cooperate with this, in light of getting the government out of the internal affairs of the church. Sorry, there's so much in that small bit, but there you have it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.